for your organization, where would kind of a different Regtech solution be most relevant? So can I just ask, are any of your organizations trying to automate any of these kind of data collection processes at all? Any kind of examples that people could share? Yeah. And your organization, any examples just help to illustrate this or give some context?
As a supervisors, we receive a lot of data, like from regulated institutions, also from credit bureaus, and basically there are a lot of kind of data, big data, and these technologies might be useful, like to help this very simple compliance process, like because there are some small decisions, like maybe to compare reports or identify some kind of strange movements. So potentially this could be used there. So yeah, we even tried something. To be honest, so far it's not kind of something very productive. But yeah, there are some efforts there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Any other kind of organizations in terms of trying to automate any of those processes at all? Okay. Well, let's have a look at some of the use cases. Maybe this can kind of spark some kind of thoughts or ideas that would be relevant in your kind of institution. So for the private sector, let's just have a think about some of the kind of use cases that we've seen from the perspective of Regtech providers. So being able to keep track of changing regulations. So dynamic compliance. If regulation changes, how do you get an alert as a firm to make sure that you know something is coming up to be changed, to make sure that you're constantly able to keep up to speed with that. Identity management and control. How do you make sure you've got kind of automated processes in place to be able to, for example, conduct KYC or due diligence on people, conduct AML checks, and be able to detect fraud. So maybe you've heard of different third-party providers or vendors that help with kind of KYC or AML management, for example. So that's a kind of a good example within Regtech. For the private sector, within risk management. So what types of data can be generated that can map to your risk monitoring as part of an organization to classify the different data into different risks that you are monitoring and checking. That's another area. Obviously, regulatory reporting is a really big area to try to automate that process as much as possible. Often it's a combination of kind of manual reporting processes and automated reporting processes, but there's a lot of activity within the Regtech sector that's focused on this. And then also on kind of transaction monitoring, being able to see kind of the activities of different firms, how they are acting within the market, and be able to highlight any market abuse, for example, or insider trading within communications. That's quite a common use case of Regtech. So in terms of the proportion of Regtech firms that we had surveyed, actually KYC, know your business, know your customer, they were the most common use cases for different Regtech providers, as well as AML and CFT. So over half of the survey respondents that we'd spoken to, that was their main focus area for Regtech. Fraud detection was also another key area within private sector Regtech. Also ensuring governance, management accountability, identifying potential conflicts of interest by, for example, doing background checks on people and assessing network connections, personal data protection and ensuring privacy laws in Europe, for example, with GDPR. Trade and market surveillance, so insider trading or market manipulation, these are very common areas that we found. Tax compliance and reporting, financial reporting, and cybersecurity. So these are some of the most common areas that we've seen as use cases in terms of what the Regtech providers are doing. So if we look here at the functional areas that different Regtech firms are providing, here you can see the focus areas in terms of what the Regtech solutions actually do. So the top four you can see here: data collection and reporting, so different tools to be able to support that. Secondly, data analysis and decision making. Thirdly, risk identification, aggregation and management. And fourthly, regulatory management information tools. So the Regtech industry at the moment, there's a lot of focus on these four areas. There's lots of other areas as well, and you can go into detail if you like, have a look at the Regtech report. But you can see other common areas: predictive analysis for fraud. So for example, maybe in the insurance sector, being able to look at different types of behavior of users that can predict whether or not somebody is likely to commit fraud or not, either within the firm or outside. Transaction monitoring and surveillance, as we've covered. Automated audits and documentation as well. So trying to, in terms of the report generation and the audit trail that is created, trying to automate that process as much as possible. And around 20% of the firms that we surveyed focused on technology specifically for regulators. So it's a relatively small proportion of the total Regtech activity, but still, as we'll cover, a growing area. So how about for Regtech for regulators? What are some of the use cases? So the Bank for International Settlements has done quite a lot of research in this area. We'll come on to one of the reports that recommend having a look at if you're interested in a second. So data input approach. So how can basically institutions automatically send their data in a more structured format so that the regulator doesn't have to spend lots of time trying to organize that data? So different approaches for trying to provide a structure to data that is then sent to the regulator. A second more technology-focused approach is how the regulator can integrate with the business systems in order to pull the information automatically. So be able to go into a regulated firm and be able to have systems in place to be able to extract the information that's needed for supervision. A third I suppose, more complicated use case for regulators is dynamic and predicted supervision. So being able to look at the behavior of a particular firm and be able to determine if this is likely to be risky and therefore take preventative action. I think probably more further into the future is real-time access. So data is available in real time across the whole firm that is able to then be organized and structured rather than given reporting periods. So rather than have, say, quarterly reports, you could have real-time access to all the information in all the firms. I don't think we are quite there yet. Another kind of government use case is kind of reporting utilities. So being able to have systems in place to help facilitate regulated firms in their reporting requirements, so that you create systems that make it much easier for regulated firms and cheaper to be able to report the information to you. Another area is gathering unstructured data. So maybe as a regulator you already have more than enough data, but there's still more out there. There's data that's not required by firms to report. Maybe it's social media data or certain kind of information about them on the internet that could be useful in terms of helping you to make decision making. So being able to have systems and processes in place to be able to collect that information, or structuring it. If you have lots of PDFs that you have to go through, being able to take that information and organizing it in a more structured way. And then finally, regulatory submissions and data quality management. So being able to have tools to be able to see the information that regulated firms send to you and be able to assess if that information is in the necessary standard or level of quality that you need in order to do your job as regulators. So here, and if you remember, so Regtech is a really broad range of different activities that includes Suptech. And Suptech is supervisory technologies that is for supervisors and regulators. So the Bank for International Settlements, there's quite a good report if you're interested, called Suptech Generations. And they have looked at the kind of taxonomy or structure of Suptech applications in terms of data collection and data analytics. So data collection is about reporting and data management. Data analytics about market surveillance, misconduct analysis, and then micro and macro prudential. In addition, also dissemination as well, because often kind of information that a regulator receives about the industry or the market then needs to be communicated back to the industry as well. So there's kind of also a dissemination as well. And each of these areas, they can be kind of broken down into many different subsections. So I won't go through all of these, but for example, within reporting, you've got automated reporting and real-time monitoring, for example. So each of those kind of different areas have different applications. And as the Regtech industry evolves, you can see different use cases there. So if we look at, say, misconduct analysis, maybe it's looking at anti-money laundering or financing of terrorism, fraud, mis-selling, so trying to look at those different behaviors that are regulated against in the market and see if there are automated techniques to be able to detect signals and information to say that this type of behavior is happening. You need to take action rather than a manual process where you're looking for that type of activity in the market. Also virtual assistants as well. So rather than people on your team taking time and spending kind of energy to be able to deal with questions. I know, for example, I think the BSP, the Central Bank of Philippines, they were working with the Regtech for regulators, which we'll come on to in a little bit. But they tried to develop a system to help automatically deal with complaints against both the industry but also the regulators as well. So to be able to automate that process, to classify the type of complaint it is, and to be able to organise that and send that to the appropriate person. So that the consumers feel like they're getting a quick response rather than sending an email and waiting many weeks to hear back a response, for example. They're able to get an instant computer-generated response that can then kind of focus their problem to the right people.
It's basically chatbot?
Yep. Exactly, yep. Okay. Here are, so we saw the different kind of use cases within Suptech, but where most of the activity is happening, you can see here. So within kind of use cases and applications of Suptech, automated reporting is where most of the action is happening. So how can you automate reports either from regulated firms or be able to do that internally for kind of regulatory purposes. Misconduct analysis, so AML, CFT, also another major area, mis-selling and fraud. So really kind of reporting, real-time monitoring, misconduct or conduct regulations, they're the two most common use cases for Suptech at the moment. And perhaps that is because they are the kind of the lowest hanging fruit, the most, maybe they place the biggest burdens on people's time within the regulator, and therefore that is where the focus area should be. But maybe if you look here, say on micro-prudential supervision, looking at operational risk, there's very little Suptech activity happening in that area at the moment. Maybe that is not because it's not important, but because it's much more challenging technically to be able to address. So maybe in the future, as kind of these different types of firms evolve and develop their proposition, then they'll be looking into other areas that will be relevant for supervisors at the moment. But at the moment, I think we see most of the activity within reporting and misconduct analysis. So in terms of the technologies as well, I'm not sure kind of how relevant this is for the kind of operations of how you look at different Regtech solutions, but still it's interesting to see kind of what these different providers are using. So you can see in yellow is what the Regtech firms are currently using, and in grey what they are considering to use in the short to medium term. So cloud computing is pretty widespread across the industry, which is not really surprising. I think most digital businesses these days rely on cloud computing. Machine learning is becoming a major aspect of different Regtech solutions. Predictive data analytics also. And you can see that these are also growth areas as well. So 16% of the regulators said that machine learning was something that they were going to be looking at. Also predictive analytics, about 14% said that that is something they're going to be looking at. So growing areas. Data transfer protocols, again, so kind of APIs is a key component of many different Regtech firms. And natural language processing, so basically using computers to analyze text, analyze computer language, and be able to make sense of that and classify it and use that as more structured data than human text. Deep learning, semantic graph analysis, and robot process automation are three other technologies that are of growing importance. You can see with the grey there. And in terms of these technologies for these Regtech providers, are they building it internally or are they outsourcing it to third-party vendors? In orange, you can see what is being built internally by these different providers. And the grey, you can see it's being bought in externally, but then customized. So maybe there's a third-party vendor that provides this, but then they need to change the technology to make it apply to their own needs. And then in this kind of green color is external, off the shelf, just another party software. You just buy it and then you start using that process. So you can see with predictive analytics, most of the predictive analytics is developed in-house. So stuff to do with kind of predictive analytics, machine learning and deep learning, semantic graph analysis, data transfer, natural language processing. So a lot of the kind of data-related or data analytics tools are being developed in-house, which I suppose kind of makes sense because a lot of these Regtech firms will be differentiating themselves on how they are able to process the structured and the unstructured data. So they want to build that in-house rather than letting other third-party providers try and provide that. DLT is much less common in Regtech firms for the private sector, but as you'll see in a second, I think there's a lot more interest from regulators in DLT and blockchain, much more than there is in the private sector. It'd be great to hear any thoughts on that in a few moments. And then, so there's a few other kind of technology areas as well that are being built in-house. But I think the key point here is that stuff to do with data analytics is really being developed in-house by these Regtech providers. Now, if we look at regulators, so 8% of private sector firms are developing DLT applications, but nearly half of regulators are exploring the use of distributed ledger technologies or blockchain. So it seems to be a kind of a really topical area that regulators, much more than the private sector, seem to be exploring in terms of Regtech. And then regulators also are focused on the application of machine learning. I suppose given just the vast quantities of data that regulators will have, probably much more than individual firms, if they're receiving all the different data types from all the different firms, lots more to deal with and to be able to process. So machine learning and data analytics tools are very, very important. But similarly, you can see data transfer protocols, APIs, NLP, and cloud computing are kind of key technology areas. Let's just come back to some of these use cases. So yeah, I mean, in terms of, now that you've kind of seen where the Regtech industry is focused on, for you in your organization, what other kind of key pain points would you say? What would you see as most useful for Regtech solutions, given kind of some inspiration here? In general, basically repeats what you said. It's the data collection reporting, it's the detection and analysis of fraud, misconduct, non-compliance, and MIS basically. Data is sometimes it's a huge amount of data, but it's making sense of it in terms of looking at different aspects of from the regulator's perspective of financial service companies. Yeah. It makes sense, and then also taking you said yourself, banks are one thing, and now you have fintech payment companies and small, so their transaction amounts are fast. So this is great. Thank you. So kind of making use of data in relation to reporting and transaction monitoring and kind of new types of entities. Any other comments or thoughts on kind of different use cases that are most useful in your organization? Okay. Do you think your organization would be can you see this becoming of growing importance? Is kind of looking at Regtech and looking at the automation of processes, can you see that being useful, or is that kind of a long way off?
I think it's useful for after that you know your client processes. Yeah, you could use that in order to ensure that your customers are properly documented and that regulatory requirements are in place, right? Yeah, it's useful in the near term.
Useful in the near term, thank you. Any other kind of comments on how long this process is going to take in your organization?
I'm not for the regulatory organization, but I work with a few. And in India, for example, I see the regulators and government authorities focusing a lot on data collection right now. Of course, they are experimenting with all of this, But today I would say their more emphasis would be on KYC, biometrics, more on tracking transactions, money laundering, terror funding. 3, lot of emphasis on data collection. For example, land record digitization, knowing where the assets are. And once that's in place, then I think they will move a little upwards and try doing machine learning and artificial intelligence on that. But yeah, that would be the scheme of things in at least organizations with whom I work.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So kind of KYC, AML, but also kind of reporting. Brilliant. So just looking at kind of some more of the Regtech firms and where they're operating, we found nearly all of them have a presence in multiple markets. And some of them, around a third, have a presence in more than 5 markets. So we're seeing these different firms kind of connecting with different users in many different countries, which is not perhaps surprising, given that many of the financial services firms are operating in different countries, and many Regtechs are looking to serve financial services firms. In the UK, you can see a very active Regtech market. And I think Regtech